virtual side event to the Human Rights Council on the United Arab Emirates. This event is titled COVID-19, Time to Free Ahmed Mansoor and All UAE Human Rights Defenders Detained in Abhorrent Conditions. My name is Sophia Kaltenbrunner. I am the campaign manager at the International Campaign for Freedom in the UAE. Side event to the Human Rights Council on the United Arab Emirates. This event is. There's a bit of a delay. I can hear myself. Just 1 second. I'm really sorry about this. Okay, this should be fixed now. And my name is Sophia Kaltenbrunner. I will be moderating this event, which has been jointly organized with Americans for Democracy and Human Rights in Bahrain, the International Center for Justice and Human Rights, Al-Qasd, and MENA Rights Group. And on behalf of all 5 organizations, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this important event today. March 2021 marks the 10th anniversary of the Arab Spring in the UAE. It's the 10th anniversary of the launching of the petition calling for democratic reform, which was published in March 2011. This petition called for free elections and independent judiciary, as well as for the Federal National Council to be given legislative powers. However, of course, the UAE authority reacted very, very brutally to this peaceful request for democratic reform and arrested the signatories and tried 94 of them in a grossly unfair mass trial in 2013, which has since become known as the UAE 94 trial for its 94 defendants. All but 2 of those who were imprisoned in the wake of this peaceful petition for democratic reform remain behind bars to this day. This even includes those who have fully served their 7-year sentences. And of course, March 2021 also marks 4 years since the arrest of Ahmed Mansoor, who is possibly the UAE's most prominent human rights defender. He's an activist and a poet, and he has now spent 4 years in solitary confinement, which is an unimaginable ordeal in terrible conditions in an Abu Dhabi prison, all for his peaceful and legitimate work as a human rights defender. In the course of our discussion today, our panelists will shed more light on the discussion on the plight of human rights defenders from different angles. And I'm very pleased to say that we have a great lineup of speakers today. We have Brian Dooley, the advisor to the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders. We have Ines Osman, who is the co-founder and the director at MENA Rights Group. Hamad Al-Shamsi, who is an Emirati social media activist, and Julia Legner, who is head of advocacy at Al-Qasd for Human Rights. And please feel free if you have any questions, if any questions arise while the speakers talk, please just post them in the comment box here on Zoom, and we'll have some time at the end for a Q&A session. Now, without any further ado, I'm pleased to introduce our first speaker, Brian Dooley, who will speak in his capacity as advisor to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation on human rights defenders. Brian, over to you.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you very much for organizing this event and for inviting me. I'm here, today on behalf of the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, Mary Lawler. And I'll be talking in that capacity around the mandate of the Human Rights Defender Special Rapporteur. Mary, as many of you may know, issued a public statement last month around human rights defenders imprisoned in the UAE centered around Ahmed Mansoor, Mohammed al-Rokan, and Nisbin Gaith. And we've known, of course, for a long time that the situation for defenders in the UAE has been enormously difficult. I don't think that the UAE has quite got the attention that some other Gulf countries have got in terms of how difficult it is for human rights defenders to operate, but it's certainly been true for a very long time. Before I was in this role, I went to the UAE in 2015, spent a few days with Ahmed Mansoor before, of course, he was put in prison. And he and I were on the advisory board of the Gulf Center for Human Rights for several years together. And it's really heartbreaking to think about what's happened to him and what is still happening to him. I mean, one of the patterns that we see in the UAE is that defenders are targeted with sometimes very long prison sentences. And not only are they sent to prison for a very long time on spurious fabricated charges, but even in detention, they are often mistreated or tortured. I know that the title of this event is around COVID and why that's a reason to free human rights defenders. And absolutely it is, but I mean, even before COVID and God willing, we get to a post-COVID world, those human rights defenders should not be in prison in the first place. That's the main principle. Obviously, COVID does complicate and exacerbate the problem. And it was in the middle of May last year, I mean, we're getting on now, that's like 10 months ago, that the World Health Organization and the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights jointly issued guidance around freeing people from places of detention in the interests of health, because COVID was clearly such a threat to prisoners and prison staff, and that these places of detention where you get a lot of people held together are obviously breeding grounds for COVID. So that's a reason that the human rights defenders ought to be released from prison, but with or without that, they ought to never have been put into prison in the first place. And one of the priorities for the UN Special Rapporteur's mandate is the long-term sentencing of human rights defenders. Mary gave her report earlier on this week to the UN Human Rights Council, and that was on the issue of the killing of human rights defenders and the threats that precede them. Her next report, which she'll deliver to the UN General Assembly in October, will be on this very issue of human rights defenders who are sentenced to long terms in detention. And of course, the UAE is one of those countries that does that. And in terms of some practical things that people could do, we really need your help with that report, with that research to present to the UN. To all member states, including, of course, to the UAE. And on the UN, the website of Mary's at OHCHR, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defender website, there's a very short questionnaire which we encourage people to fill in. And it's asking three things, basically. First is, do you know of cases of human rights defenders who have been sentenced to long terms in prison? Secondly, what ideas do you have to prevent that happening? And thirdly, for those who have been sentenced to long terms in prison and are enduring those prison sentences, what ideas do you have, or what have you seen elsewhere in the world that helps have those people freed before the completion of their sentences? Those are very useful things for us when we're looking at how to figure out how to best advocate on this issue. It's not just about the UAE, but clearly the UAE is one of the places where it's happening, where defenders are in long-term detention and where they're also being mistreated and tortured too. I think I'll stop there for the moment, but looking forward to hearing what other people say and to joining in the rest of the discussion. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Brian, for your insight and for mentioning the opinion that the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights defenders will be issuing in October on the long-term imprisonment of human rights defenders, which in fact is the case. Ahmed Mansoor has been sentenced to 10 years in prison. And thank you also for pointing out the questionnaire. Please, if anyone in the audience would like to take part and provide their ideas and opinions, that's surely a very good thing to do. Providing a legal context for this type of repression and treatment of prisoners in detention that Brian just mentioned will be Ines Osman. She is the co-founder and director of MENA Rights Group, which is a Geneva-based organization defending and promoting human rights in the MENA region. Ines, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone. So as Sophia explained, I'm going to touch briefly on the legal framework that has basically allowed for this repressive environment to happen and to exist. And I want to highlight, as Brian said, that this is one of the most repressive legal framework in the region. It's just that it's maybe less known and cases are not as much highlighted as for other countries. So I'll mention first the cybercrime law. So most of you know that Ahmed Mansoor is currently serving a 10-year prison sentence for, among others, insulting the status and prestige of the UAE and so on and so forth on the basis of the cybercrime law. So it's worth noting that that text was enacted soon after the beginning of the Arab uprisings 10 years ago in 2011, and probably conscious of the role played by social media in protest all over the region, a number of countries, including the UAE, enacted cybercrime and other media-related legislation in a move to basically restrict freedom of expression online. So the 2012 cybercrime law provides for harsh prison sentences up to life in prison for anyone who publishes information aiming or calling to overthrow or change the ruling system of the state. And this provision has been used to crack down on any peaceful dissident online. The law also criminalizes acts such as insulting the ruler, damaging national unity or the reputation of the state. And I also want to add that the cybercrime law also forbids the publication of so-called rumors that would damage state reputation. And as such, the UAE have also, like many other countries in the world, been able to use that fake news narrative to shut down all forms of criticism. I'll now move to the penal code, which also includes a number of highly restrictive provisions. So in 2016, a decree was issued to amend the penal code. And back then, the authorities introduced a number of very, very concerning provisions. I'll just cite a few, but a new article now punishes with 15 to 25 years in prison anyone who insults the president of the UAE, and with 10 to 25 years in prison anyone who insults, mocks, harms the reputation, prestige, statute of the state, the flag, the emblem, and so on. Other articles further restrict the right to freedom of expression, for example, by criminalizing the communication of ideas that endanger state security, which obviously leaves room for broad interpretation. And last but not least, the amendments also brought a provision that provides for up to 10 years in prison for anyone who commits any hostile act against a foreign country that could expose the UAE to the severance of diplomatic relations. And what's interesting is that there is a high number of foreigners who've been prosecuted in the UAE, not for criticizing the UAE, but for criticizing the authorities or whatever else in their home country. The last piece of legislation that has played a huge role in the crackdown on free speech is the 2014 counterterrorism law. So the first problem with this text is that it gives a very broad definition of terrorism, which does not necessarily entail committing any violent acts. And also includes a bunch of other non-violent expression of criticism. It also considers as a terrorist offense any act that threatens the state's stability, safety, unity, sovereignty, or security. But also that any acts that would contradict the basic principles underlying the governance system of the state. So basically, anyone committing an act that the state deems to be underlying the basic principles of the governance system, whatever that means, could be imprisoned. And as a result, since the enactment of this law, any public criticism or peaceful opposition can be considered an act of terrorism. The other problem with this text is that it provides for the establishment of so-called munasaha centers. So these are supposedly rehabilitation centers established for the purpose of quote unquote enlightenment and reform of persons convicted of terrorist offenses or persons who are seen as posing a terrorist threat. In 2019, there was actually a new law that was enacted providing for the establishment of a national munasaha/rehabilitation center. And it extended the mandate that was given to these centers under the counterterrorism law to basically provide for the counseling and rehabilitation of holders of terrorist, extremist, or deviant thought, which clearly is also left to very broad interpretation and can mean anything and everything. The issue with these so-called rehabilitation centers is twofold. First of all, the munasaha regime is basically a form of administrative detention that can be renewed indefinitely. And the law doesn't provide for any requirement to be brought before a judge. And there is also no limit as to how many times a judge can renew the detention under that rehabilitation regime. Secondly, this munasaha regime has also been used to actually extend the detention of a number of prisoners of conscience who had already served their prison sentence. And that has been the case in a number of individuals convicted as part of the mass trial of the UAE 94 who served their prison sentence and then continued to be held in the same prison under that regime. And I just want to highlight that the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Counterterrorism sent a communication to the UAE in November last year highlighting this flawed counterterrorism framework. So with all of that in mind, we can clearly see that the authorities are able to rely on a vast number of very vague and broad provisions from the penal code, the cybercrime law, the counterterrorism law. And this has really opened the door to arbitrary interpretation and been used to prosecute acts of free speech. I just want to, last but not least, highlight something that I believe is very important, which is the lack of independence of the judiciary. All human rights defenders, peaceful critics, journalists, they've all been prosecuted before the State Security Chamber of the Federal Supreme Court, including Ahmed Mansoor. And this court is actually an exceptional jurisdiction which covers cases of terrorism and state security, but that also includes charges under the cybercrime law and the penal code. So Ahmed Mansoor, though he was not sentenced under the terrorism law as such, he was still prosecuted before that court because it has jurisdiction over other provisions of other texts. Trials before this court are unfair due to a number of reasons. I'll just cite two. I mean, it lacks independence and impartiality because judges are appointed by presidential decree after ratification by the cabinet. So there is a serious lack of independence from the executive. And second, that chamber acts as a court of first instance and appeal. So that means that defendants have no real possibility to appeal the verdict. And obviously this comes in addition to a high number of violations of fair trial and due process guarantees. So lawyers being denied access to the file, hearings held during closed sessions, or the admissions of confessions extracted under torture as evidence. So to conclude, the many flaws that we can find in the UAE legal framework, coupled with the lack of independence of the judiciary are what has essentially allowed the UAE authorities to crack down on freedom of expression, peaceful assembly, and association, and ultimately has rendered civic space non-existent today in the country.
Thank you very much, Ines, for this detailed account on the legal background that the UAE authorities use to, in a way, justify repression. It's very interesting to hear about the legal justification for the Nasaha centers in particular. It seems very, very strange to us, perhaps, to imprison prisoners beyond their sentence because they are deemed not to have changed their minds in a way. This is a very, very vague thing to do. How would you establish whether a prisoner is reformed? And it's very, very interesting to hear about this provision in the anti-terrorism law. So thank you very much for pointing this out. And this actually also will be covered from a very personal perspective by our next speaker, Hamad Al-Shamsi. Hamad is a social media activist from the Emirates, and he was one of the 94 defendants who were tried in the UAE 94 trial for his political activism. He was sentenced to 15 years of imprisonment in absentia. Hamad, you have the floor. Hello, can you hear me?
Sorry, Sophia.
Yes, you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Sophia. And I am really delighted to be here and to be part of this panel to discuss the human rights situation in the United Arab Emirates. What I am going to focus on, I'm going to focus on some examples, and I will give some examples about how the authority is practicing violations against the prisoners of conscience in the United Arab Emirates. And I would like to also mention that whatever you're gonna hear now from me is not actually an isolated incident. These incidents or these violations has been practiced over years in the United Arab Emirates against the prisoners of conscience, and it became like a pattern, and it became like a systematic way of treating prisoners of conscience and their families. The first violations that I would like to highlight is keeping people in prisons beyond their sentence. And we have at least documented 13 people, prisoners of conscience, still in prison beyond their sentence. They have completed their sentence years ago, but the authority is still refusing to release these people and to send them back to their families and to their homes. And I will give some examples, and maybe the first examples I would like to highlight and to mention here is the examples of Abdullah Al-Hulu. Abdullah Al-Hulu is, he was detained in 2014, and he was charged of being a member of Al-Islah group in the United Arab Emirates. He then was sentenced to 3 years, and the 3 years sentence was expired last in the 2017, in April of 2017. But Abdullah Al-Hulu is still in prison. He almost doubled the sentence in the prison. 4 years beyond his sentence. However, Abdullah is still in the prison. I think this is very dangerous, and this is very serious violations, because this violation is not against Abdullah himself. It is not against the prisoners of conscience themselves. However, it is against the whole family. I mean, the mother, I mean, the children, Abdullah has children, Abdullah has grandchildren, they all affected, and I mean, by this violation, and I think their right has been violated. I will give another example, and this example of Abdullah Al-Hajari. Abdullah Al-Hajari was sentenced also to 7 years. I'm just giving you examples just to show this is not an isolated incident. It is like become a part of the violations of the system that the UAE doing. Abdullah Al-Hadri was sentenced to 7 years back in 2012, and then because actually he was one of the people in the famous UAE 94 case, and he was sentenced to 7 years, and the 7 years was expired in July of 2019, and Abdullah is still in the prisons. So the authority is keeping Abdullah in the prisons almost 2 years beyond his sentence. I mean, he served the sentence, however, Abdullah is still in the prisons. Maybe the last examples I would like to highlight here in regard to this violation is the example of Amina Al-Abduli. Amina is a mother of 5. She was detained in 2015, and she was sentenced to 5 years plus 500,000 dirham, which is around 127 USD, because of a tweet. And Amina actually has served her sentence back in last November, so almost four months ago. But the authority is still refusing to send Amina back to her family, and to her children. Amina is a mother of 5, and her children is almost all of them are under 18. So this is why it is a violation not against Amina, but also against the family of Amina. What the authority is doing here, they are just renewing the sentence of these people indefinitely. I mean, nobody knows when these people are going to be back home. I mean, it is like an administrative detention. What they do, they just bring the prisoners of conscience before the judge, and they just, I mean, the judge does rule that his sentence will be extended for an extra 6 months, and this is going to be renewed again and again. This is very serious violations, as I mentioned, and I believe this is not affected. I mean, not only the prisoners of conscience is affected by it, but the whole family. Having said that, I would like to highlight the other violations, which is a collective punishment against the family of prisoners in UAE. The UAE has been doing this kind of punishment for years. Again, the family against the family of prisoners of conscience. And maybe I would like to refer you to a very excellent report by Human Rights Watch. It was published last year. It is titled "Harassment of Dissident Family in the UAE." In that report, they documented very critical violations like travel bans, active surveillance, and just a lot of other violations. Maybe one violation I would like to highlight here is that the authority is refusing to renew the IDs, the document, the national IDs of many of the prisoners of conscience. And 2 weeks ago, we learned that one of the daughters of the prisoners of conscience couldn't get COVID vaccine because she has no a valid ID. This is very serious. I mean, maybe if you are in the UAE, you know what does it mean to have no ID and to have no a valid ID. If you have no valid ID in the United Arab Emirates, you almost stateless. You cannot do anything. You cannot have access to medical services. You cannot have your license to be renewed. I mean, you can't have nothing in the UAE. And this is very critical. I mean, the UAE has been practicing such kind of punishment against the families of the dissident or the families of the prisoners of conscience for years, and they're just keeping the people over there without any valid ID. These violations and these examples I wanted to highlight here. Maybe to conclude, I would like to just say whatever I started with, that these incidents are not isolated incidents. These incidents has been practiced over years, and it is against a lot of their, of the prisoners, against a lot of the prisoners of conscience and their families. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your account about these specific cases of indefinite detention, and for pointing out that there are also female prisoners who are imprisoned in the UAE beyond their release date. You talked about Amina Al-Abduli, who should have been released in November, but wasn't, simply wasn't. So that was very powerful. Thank you very much, and thank you also for talking about collective punishment and the huge issue that the families of prisoners of conscience face on a daily basis when they are either made stateless or have travel bans put up on them and are unable to get a job or go to university or indeed get medical care and the vaccines for COVID-19 right now, which is extremely serious. So thank you very much. Our next speaker, last but not least, is Julia Legner. She will give us a broader perspective of UAE repression, as well as in the wider region. And she is the head of advocacy at Al-Qasd for Human Rights. Al-Qasd is an independent NGO that was set up in 2014 with the purpose of defending and promoting human rights in Saudi Arabia and the wider region. Julia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Sophia, and thank you to the partner NGOs for organizing this discussion. So as I was asked to place the violations in a regional context and maybe also refer back to the 10th anniversary of the Arab uprisings, I would just start by saying that the UAE was not so obviously or heavily affected by the Arab uprisings as were other countries in the MENA region like Egypt or Tunisia, where we saw presidents ousted. But at the end of the day, I think sort of the sentiment that swept through the region in the wake of the Arab uprisings was one of citizens demanding greater civil liberties. And I think that was the case really all throughout the region. And that was something that UAE authorities had to react on. So they kind of stifled any form of protest or unrest before it could even erupt. And they did so with harsh repression of all dissenting voices or anyone questioning the legitimacy of the authorities or demanding fundamental rights. And all throughout the regions, we witnessed the arrest of human rights defenders. I think one very emblematic case for the UAE that was already mentioned is the mass trial of the UAE 94. We saw the adoption of cybercrime laws, of anti-terrorism laws to prosecute peaceful dissidents, the acquisition of high-tech surveillance technology, and the development of cyber armies, conquering this only free space, the social media platforms that people had to voice their opinion and to actually connect during and connect and facilitate the Arab uprisings at the end of the day. And I think what we see in the UAE since the Arab uprisings up until now, or not in the UAE, but in the entire region, or probably even before, is the use of shared malpractices. And quite often they originate in the UAE. Just to mention a few of them, and they have been mentioned by other panelists already, is the revocation of nationality or the imposition of travel bans on individuals and their families as a form of reprisals. Something we have seen in recent years also is our videotaped confessions, whereby the authorities are approaching detainees, asking them to record videos in which they repent for alleged crimes they committed and basically state that they were in the wrong and thank the state for putting them back on the right path, which is really, really critical, both because it discredits sort of the campaigns that civil society are leading on prisoners of conscience for many years, And it also makes the prisoner of conscience become like a mouthpiece for the own oppressor. And we've seen this also, for example, in Saudi, where Lujain al-Hathloul was approached to record videos saying that she was never tortured. And lastly, I think these terrorism rehabilitation centers, like they're called Munasaha centers in the UAE, are also a shared malpractice. These are being used to keep individuals detained long past their official prison term, often in administrative detention without the right to appeal. And I think another element where there is a commonality between the different regions, between the different countries in the region, is that they use this reform narrative, both to weaken social movements, but also to simultaneously try to appease foreign allies. While in practice, they're really failing to implement or implementing only superficial and insufficient reforms. And despite all this, and I agree with what Brian said, is that the UAE didn't really get necessarily the same attention as other Gulf countries when it comes to rights abuses. The UAE, in fact, is often referred to or considered as a beacon of stability in the region. And that is possibly due to the fact that Dubai is like an important economic and trade hub, and the UAE authorities have, created Abu Dhabi to be this cultural center with this mega project of, for example, the Louvre or the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi, and branches of prestigious universities such as the Sorbonne or the NYU. And we see the UAE even having a Ministry of Happiness. We see the UAE hosting events such as a World Tolerance Summit, the Hay Festival, this year, the Expo. So the authorities have managed quite successfully also to attract tourism to the UAE, and they have done a fairly good job in polishing their image and selling their polished image to Western allies. And that is also due to the fact that they have large lobbying presences in Washington and in other European capitals to ensure their influence. So, for example, contrary to their neighbor Saudi Arabia, the UAE were just better at hiding their poor human rights records behind all that and behind the glitzy facades of the skyscrapers. And while they might be genuinely interested in pursuing economic and technological progress, they're surely not a progressive society. Not as long as they're denying citizens and residents basic fundamental rights. So just to give a very quick overview of what multilateral actions we've seen on the UAE in the past, and what needs to be done next. Maybe that can then open up the discussion. I think the UN human rights system was quite effective in a way on the UAE, or at least the special procedures and the UN independent experts have been quite vocal on violations in the UAE. There have been several urgent appeals and communications sent to the UAE authorities in the past years. These include, like Ines mentioned, the most recent communication on the flawed anti-terrorism law, but they include cases of human rights defenders, migrant workers, of women in detention, the case of Princess Latifa, but also pertain to other issues such as business and human rights, or even education. We've also seen a large number of opinions adopted by the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention on several individuals over the year arbitrarily detained in the UAE. Unfortunately, the UAE has implemented hardly any of those opinions, and the individuals concerned remain in detention. There has been some action also at the EU level. However, I would say far less. We have seen, for example, a resolution in the European Parliament in 2012 on the general situation on human rights in the UAE, We've also in 2018 had a resolution on human rights defender Ahmed Mansoor. And surely the UAE have also been reprimanded in most recent resolutions on Yemen for their role and involvement in Yemen, asking states to issue arms embargoes and refer the violations committed in Yemen to the ICC. So while the UN independent experts, I would say, were fairly active on the UAE, clearly more needs to be done. Whether you consider the denial of basic rights, the crackdown on peaceful dissidents, violations on women's rights, migrants' rights, the widespread practice of torture, the UAE human rights record is pretty shocking. And also, I think one needs to look at the UAE's geopolitical role, and be that in Syria or the Yemen war or the conflict in Libya. So that leads me to ask, like, what needs to happen for change to come, or what actions need to be taken? And there I would like to maybe again switch back to Saudi Arabia and give a bit of an overview of what we've seen there. Like, for many years, the international community, despite its very well-known poor human rights record, was rather silent on Saudi Arabia. And I think what has been a big game changer was the gruesome killing of Jamal Khashoggi in the consulate, the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, after which the international community has been clearly has become more outspoken and more critical of Saudi Arabia, and pressure has been building on several multilateral layers. So the question is, what would have to happen? You know, what more has to happen in the UAE for that would warrant that shift in countries' policies towards the country? Like, isn't it enough what we've already seen, like the horrendous treatment of human rights defenders such as Ahmed Mansoor, but also the kidnapping and detention of Princess Latifa and Shamsa, or the widespread practice of torture that affects both Emirati nationals but also foreign nationals. So I would say that these countries, from my opinion, do react to international pressure. So I would say it would be great to see increased pressure from the international community that is multi-layered, that would have to include civil society action. It would have to include media coverage for the abuses that are happening, to raise general awareness in the public. But of course, political and ultimately pressure from business stakeholders. So I would love to see business and political stakeholder use their leverage to advance human rights in the UAE, and to condition their collaboration with the UAE authorities to the improvement or genuine human rights reform in the country. But I'm sure that the other panelists probably have a few more ideas of what is needed for the situation to improve. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, for sharing your insight. This was really very interesting to hear the UAE put into the wider context of the region, and also the comparison to Saudi Arabia, the shared malpractices, and what might be maybe slightly different. And it's very interesting that you also pointed out, which I think is very, very important, the UAE's strategy of creating this very tolerant, open image, which is really purely a facade to attract tourism, attract international investment, and also to be a legitimate ally to the EU, the UK, the US, and so forth. This might actually also be a strategy that Saudi Arabia is now also adopting. So thank you very much also for pointing out the international responses that we have seen so far, which there have been some, but not enough. I totally agree there with you. And it would be very important to see in the near future more of these, maybe a resolution from the UN Human Rights Council or from the EU Parliament, So this is definitely something that that we as the public who can influence public opinion and thereby change political will really have to ask for, to demand, especially now also with Princess Latifa, which is truly a horrible case. If we as the public are outraged by how she's being treated in detention, then it will be much more difficult for the UK government, for example, to count on the UAE as the major partner in the Middle East, as the beacon of hope, as you said, Julia. Okay, so I'm curious to hear some of the questions that have come in. My colleague Mohammed has been reading them as they were posted. Mohammed, would you like to choose one and read it out, please?
Hi, Sophia. Yes, I can go through them. We have the first question is from Raniwat. The question is addressed to Ines, and everybody is welcome to answer it. So the question is, why is the issues in the UAE, which are virtually identical to the human rights violations and procedures in Saudi, for example, not discussed as much in Western media? Is it due to lack of access, or does the UAE have a better relationship with Western powers, tourism, sporting events, etc.? So the question is directed to Ines, and if any other of the panelists would like to or saying is welcome. So
maybe I'll try to be brief, because I think Julia did answer some of the question. But I think that the game that the Saudis are kind of playing now, that PR strategy, the UAE have been using that strategy for a while longer than the Saudi have, by, you know, with the place of Dubai and tourism, having like sports, cultural events and so on. So I think they've been able to rely on that image for a while. And maybe I can actually pass the floor to Hamad, but I feel like with the arrest of Ahmed Mansoor, like there was really a gap, because little by little, all activists, human rights defenders, journalists were all arrested by one, and Ahmed Mansoor was kind of the last source for human rights NGOs and activists abroad. And when he was arrested, at least it's my feeling, we had no one to contact. And I think for a few years, it became quite difficult to follow up on these cases, on his case and many others, because families are also very scared. We didn't talk about cyber surveillance today, but that's also a big issue. And the issue of collective punishment, statelessness, and all the reprisals that the circles of these people, the relatives are facing, I think has made it very difficult for the rest of the world to sort of know about what's happening. And I feel like it's only kind of now that we're sort of regaining a bit of a momentum and these violations are becoming known again. But I really felt like there was a sort of gap for like a couple of years. But maybe Hamad, you wanna, as the Emirati, you wanna go ahead?
Yes, maybe I can add that, I mean, I can maybe emphasize whatever Ines has mentioned, that the UAE spent a lot of money on PRs all over the world, and they has been practicing this for years. And even though they have buying a lot of people, and so they're buying the silence of people outside, so maybe a lot of politicians outside, maybe in Europe, maybe in the US, even a lot of media, they spend a lot of money on these kind of campaigns. So that's why you are not able to hear a lot of violations that are being practiced in the UAE.
Thank you, Hamid. The second question is from Laura. At the beginning, she's saying that nearly a month ago, Taysir al-Najjar, a journalist imprisoned for his online criticism of the UAE, died after being released from prison 2 years ago. The question for Brian and Enis, are there any international mechanisms in place to assist released prisoners traumatized by their imprisonment in the UAE? Brian?
Thanks. It takes a second to unmute there. Not much is the answer. And I think that this is a much wider problem, not just around prisoners released from the UAE, but prisoners released from other countries too. There have been for a while some sort of specialists, one center based in Copenhagen in Denmark and one in Minnesota, to really understand and go through counseling with survivors of torture. But I'm reading more and more, I'd say in the last 2 years or so, about the attention which is needed to be given to this sort of issue, whether it's post-traumatic stress syndrome or stress disorder, excuse me, or also more and more human rights defenders who are affected by the work that they're doing. You know, up until very recently, that was just sort of part of the job and you were supposed to get on with it. And if you came out of prison, you were just supposed to go back to your family and get over it. And I think at least there's a realization that isn't good enough. But frankly, I don't think that we, meaning most of the rest of the world, really understand what to do about it or how to help. I did try years ago to do to try and create a setup like an online counseling service with people who've been released from prison in another Gulf country, and it never quite worked because of people trusting the security of the internet connection. And in country, I doubt that there are many specialists. I don't know about the UAE, but I would very much doubt that there are enough specialists in terms of people with the right medical training and experience to be able to take that on. It's a huge problem, and there is no good solution to it yet. I'd say the only glimmer of hope is that it's being recognized as a major problem now, and hopefully that will lead to resources being put into fixing it.
Thank you, Brian. Enis, would you like to elaborate more?
Thank you. I'll be very quick. I just wanted to highlight that the UAE ratified the Convention Against Torture in 2012, and they were supposed to be reviewed for the first time by the Committee Against Torture in April 2020. Unfortunately, COVID happened, so the session was cancelled once and has been postponed one more time and will happen in April of 2022, hopefully. But although it doesn't address per se the trauma of people who were detained and tortured in the UAE, we also hope that this will be an occasion for victims and former detainees to also use that platform to bring their testimonies and get a recognition that that these were a violation of their rights. So just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you. And that was the first part of her question. And the second question is addressed to Hamid. How do you see such assistance playing out in practice in the UAE? Do you think this is good? This is a good first step towards a reform?
Yes, maybe I would like to mention that Taysir al-Najjar, when he was detained and he was actually died after he was released, he just a little bit, he was not the first one to die in a prison. We have also another example of Ali Abdel Noor. I mean, this is very serious incidents. Ali Abdel Noor was died in prison, and even though the United Nations and a lot of NGOs called upon the government to release her, but they refused to release Alia until she died in the prisons. Regarding the question that asked, how do you see such a system playing out in practice? I mean, we don't see it in a practice actually in the UAE, but we hope that we can see it in a practice, but not. But in reality, it is not yet.
Thank you, Ahmed. There is a question from Saeed Shihabi. Is addressed to you, Ahmed, as well as Brian. So 10 years ago, these days, UAE and Saudi forces sent troops to crush Bahrain's revolution. No one protested except their Bahrain victims. Don't you think that silence eventually led to the emergence of these two countries?
Hello, I think we have a slight issue with the connection at the moment. Bear with me for 1 second.
Yes, do you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, maybe Brian, you want to go ahead, answer?
Yeah, I'll respond quickly. Thank you very much, Saeed, and hi. I'm not sure that's an analysis I recognise, that no one protested except the Bahraini victims. I protested, many people protested. The Western media were in uproar about it, not for very long, but there was attention on it. Certainly, there wasn't enough international pressure to stop further crackdown in Bahrain, obviously. I don't recognise that there was silence. There wasn't silence. But I think that it shows that even when there is noise about it, even when there is actually fairly extensive international media coverage around it, that doesn't necessarily generate into political will, either for the government of Bahrain or the other major powers to exert enough pressure on whether it's Bahrain or the other Gulf states. So I just don't think there's that equation. And if there was that formula, we'd all be using it, between making a lot of international fuss and therefore getting a good human rights outcome. It can work like that. And frankly, it's something we often use. But I don't think that there's necessarily a guarantee there.
Ahmed, do you have any?
I think he answered it all, but maybe if Saeed is asking about the UAE, I mean, inside the UAE, since years ago, nobody can protest in the UAE, nobody can speak up, just, I mean, anything against whatever the government would like to do. I mean, they would like to punish them. I think maybe a lot of people were against it, but these people couldn't speak as they are now. I mean, nobody now actually can speak up and against whatever is happening against the prisoners of conscience over there in the UAE. So the situation maybe in Bahrain it's a little bit different, but the situation in UAE, that the government insists on silencing everyone inside the UAE, even by buying them or by punishing them.
Thank you, Ahmed. Can you hear me? Yes, please. So the question from Anu. we've seen international cases of high-profile sports people speaking out about human rights violations. Lewis Hamilton, for example, speaking out about F1 and human rights. Has this been at all effective as a strategy in the UAE? I can address this question to Brian, if you are happy to answer it.
No, I don't know much about that, honestly. Perhaps one of the other panelists do, but I don't know about whether that has worked in the UAE.
Okay.
Yes, Julie, sorry for that.
Yes, thank you.
Okay,
I don't have a real example of that in the UAE as well, but looking at the other Gulf countries, if we look, at the Formula One, for example, in Bahrain, or we look at the Dakar Rally happening in Saudi, or Gulf tournaments now, and Super Soccer Kappa, I think there's definitely some added pressure when sports people or celebrities speak out on human rights violations or decide to boycott sports events or entertainment events in these countries. But I think, as I tried to say earlier, you'd always need like a multi-layered approach of pressure. It's not enough to have media coverage. It's not enough to have celebrities. You need civil society action, political stakeholders, business stakeholders somewhat on board with it. And I just wanted to add something actually to the earlier question on what victims of human rights abuses in the UAE, what guidance or assistance they can get after they've been released. And I just wanted to make a reference to the UAE Association of Victims of Torture, which is a congregation of individuals that endured torture in the UAE, that have come together to try and speak about that topic and raise awareness. And I also know that some of these individuals have pursued the channels of universal jurisdiction in some countries where that is possible. So if anyone, I mean, that often is only really available to foreign nationals, because if you're being released and you continue your life in the UAE, I mean, there's no way you could join such an association. But just to raise awareness of them, that if anyone is interested, they would be happy to give guidance and maybe some counseling. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mohammed. We are unfortunately running out of time. These were all really, really interesting, great questions. So thank you to the audience for asking them. It was very interesting to hear the different perspectives. So also a big thank you to the great panelists for sharing your insight and expertise when it comes to human rights in the UAE and the wider region. We have heard today about the plight of imprisoned human rights defenders and journalists. And we have also learned that those human rights defenders who have actually served their full sentences aren't always being released. There are currently more than a dozen human rights defenders who are put into so-called munasaha centers, which for all intents and purposes are prison facilities where they are kept indefinitely without access to the outside world or a lawyer. And we've also heard about the wider context of very, very systematic repression in the UAE, as well as the wider region. So thank you very, very much to the audience for joining us today. And thank you again to the panelists for your insight. Have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.